Three, two, one, here we go. Rainman's Take podcast. Observations on the world we live in. My take on current events and other topics of interest. Also interviews with some really cool people. So let's get the conversation going. Hey everybody, it's the Rain Man. My guest today is Amnon Sitchin. Amnon, how are you doing today, sir?
I'm doing great.
Great. Listen, for those of you who have listened to my podcast before, you might recognize his last name. Amnon is the brother of the late Zacharia Sitchin, who was the author of the Earth Chronicles, and kind of one of the forefathers or the godfathers of the ancient alien theory. And as you all know, that whole concept is fascinating to me. And after I spoke with Amnon's sister, his daughter, Janet, several episodes ago, I really wanted to know more about what all the research that went into the Earth Chronicles. And it just so happens that Amnon is a PhD in aerodynamics and engineering, and I'm sure we're going to get into that a little bit more. But he did a lot of the celestial mathematics and the celestial calculations for the Earth Chronicles as it relates to the planet Nibiru and its orbit through our solar system. So without further ado, Amnon, thank you very much again for joining me. Why don't you go ahead and tell me a little bit about your background, and then we'll get right into it.
I was born in Tel Aviv in Israel, and I was born in 1930, January 30, and that's when Zacharia was exactly 10 years old. So he's 10 years older than I am. But he was a great brother to me. Anyway, I, of course, went to general school in Israel with the languages Hebrew. We studied the Bible not as a religious book, as our Jewish history book. So all the meaning of the words, whether it was Genesis or other things, were my native language. The same as Zacharia, he came to Israel just before he started school. So normally his basically native language was also Hebrew. And of course, that is, if you read his book, you know that gave him understanding and deeper understanding of things, especially chapter 6 in Genesis. It's the first 4 verses of chapter 6 in Genesis is unbelievable. If you go word by word, you compare it to the King James Version, and it's all wrong.
And that was going to be one of the questions I wanted to ask you was the Bible, the Hebrew Bible that you were studying when you were a child. Is that an older version, or is that the King James? They basically turned that one into the English language, and with that, they bastardize all these words that you saw, but we don't in the King James Bible. Is that right?
Well, the King James Bible, I knew nothing about it until many years later.
Okay.
What happens, well, again, is we studied in there when I finished high school, for just the time of the Israel War of Independence. And I was interested in space and in aviation. So I came to the United States and to studied aeronautical engineering. I got my bachelor's degree at Georgia Tech with highest honors, and continued to get my master's degree. After that, I returned to Israel and to do my military service. When I finished the military service, I was on my way back to the United States for more education. but changes in family matters, the passing away of my father and mother, and Zacharia being already in New York, being the director of the American-Israel Change of Commerce, diverted me. I spent a few years in Brazil, got married there, and then came to the United States because Zacharia was the only family that I had.
Gotcha.
After working in a few small jobs as I first came, I ended up at Ford Motor Company in the engineering department of light truck engineering. But I wanted more education. I missed the missed opportunity that I had to go to MIT for an advanced degree. But the best I could do is go to the University of Florida. And I got my PhD at the University of Florida. And my research was the dynamic stability of satellites.
Wow.
So that made me an introduction to dynamics, trajectory, questions of orbits, and dynamics of going to space, basically.
Yeah.
When I got my PhD, I was looking for a teaching job. However, it was 1968, 1970. That was a time of a big commotion and protest about the Vietnam War and the military-industrial complex. So engineering education was scuttled with all of this commotion. But I did, because of my education, obvious proof of special ability, I got a teaching job at the University of Alabama in Tuscaloosa. And just about that time, well, that was already 1970. But I heard from Zacharia about 5 years earlier his ideas about the Nephilim. The Nephilim is a story that bothered him since grammar school. You all, if you read his books or if you heard his lectures, if you ever were in lectures, you know how the story of his sort of confrontation to his teacher about the meaning of the Nephilim. So he was already in the middle of research about the Nephilim, going all the back to Iraq and Sumer to get all of this story. And he was talking about Nibiru and the planet and all of these things.
Amnon, let me interrupt you real quick. For those that don't understand, the Nephilim, that is a Hebrew word that was in the Hebrew Bible that is not anywhere in the King James Bible. What does that word mean?
Again, is much of the Hebrew for many generations were just words from the Bible. Later, especially since Israel was dead, there is a need for a lot of modern words. But the Old Hebrew in the Bible, the word Nephilim appears only twice. One in chapter 6, and then once more connecting it to the sons of the giants, a name. You know, in Hebrew, it's very important the use of what's in English, excuse my pronunciation, I don't pronounce well the THs. THE. In Hebrew, there is a hey, ha. It is And it makes a very big difference how it's used in the word to know a meaning. Like it's a book and the book. A book is a book. The book is, wait a minute, which book? What about the book in this thing is? And that's the story of the Nephilim in chapter 6. It doesn't say Nephilim were upon the earth. It says the Nephilim were upon the earth. The King James translation says giants were upon the earth. So what? Also elephants were upon the earth. But it says the Nephilim is who were they? They are not general, it's who were they? And as it goes further in those four verses, comes the question is just more important. They were not giants. They were the Nephilim, something special. The word comes from the word nafal, to fall. To fall, come down, actually mostly to fall. And that's when the Sumerian called the Anunnaki, means those who came down to earth. Aha, it's the Nephilim.
Interesting.
The Nephilim, what do you mean? Those who came down, you know.
Gotcha.
You know what we are talking about.
Yeah.
And in many other places, it's very important, this particular thing is, the whole story, I can have a whole lecture about those four verses in this. Anyway,
yeah.
Zacharia was talking about that thing, is like this, but in order to have Nibiru in the middle of the solar system, he needed a hole in the planets. He needed a room in there is this. So knowing that I know about space travel and all that, he asked me about it. So I looked into it and found out that there is Bode's law. Bode's law about the spacing of the planets. But that is an artificial way to try to fit a mathematical thing is to the existing planets with nothing between Mars and Jupiter. Yes, there are a few asteroid belts in there. So I went and did all kinds of graphs in this, and I found two things. One, yes, there is a big gap. I figured out more a geometric ratio instead of Bode's law. And I found, sure enough, the asteroids, which seems to be a broken up planet, fitted perfectly in there in a geometric sequence of approximately a ratio of 1.9 between the planets. That has a lot smaller error of where the planets are away from this geometric series than Bode's law. Another thing, it explained and showed that Pluto is way off course. And of course, years later, very recently, it was decided that Pluto is not a planet. Sure enough, Pluto is correctly not a planet. Where do you see it? Those who remember Zacharia planet, Zachariah's book, one of the biggest joys he had is when he went to a museum in what was time East Berlin. And in the museum there, you know, he saw the cylinder seal. And the cylinder seal saw the solar system. And that was his joy. And one thing is that is not talked much about, that thing is, that one does not show Pluto. It shows Pluto as the moon of Saturn. And that's one justification, that even there they knew that Pluto is not that thing. I would like to, maybe we'll have an opportunity for me to suggest how Pluto was pulled out of that. Anyway, so all of that shows, and he was very happy to find that the asteroid belt fits right in there. In order, there were big gaps between Mars and Jupiter, and that exactly fitted in his idea that Tiamat was there, and then Nibiru, as it came as an intruder from outside the solar system, moved in, passed in there. So basically, the ellipse of Nibiru, the closest point to the sun, is right there, approximately I think it's about 3.5 astronomical units from the sun. Right there fits the whole story of Tiamat, the celestial battle, the breakup of Tiamat into two, and all of these things came like this. Well, so became a question is okay, what is the path, orbital path of Nibiru? One thing is, it has to be clockwise, not anti-clockwise. Now, again, the whole clockwise, counterclockwise depends on where you look at out of space. But by the convention that we use for direction of axle, the right-hand rotation makes most of the planets are in the ecliptic plane, more or less, and they rotate counterclockwise. But Nibiru, to have a collision, had to be clockwise. Okay. What else do we know about the orbit? Well, we know the period. And then there is a fellow by the name of Kepler that figured out a ratio and a rule of the orbit. So again, Zacharia asked me, and sure enough, I looked and calculated for him an orbit. The orbit is roughly 200, if I recall correctly, I think it's about 235 astronomical unit is the half of the major axis. So all of this calculation gives you basically an orbit like this is, yeah? But what is the plane of rotation? Now we know the size, but what is the plane of rotation? Now comes a few questions of what do we know about it? Somewhere along the lines, Zacharia found out some numbers about rising 30 degrees, blah, blah. And I decided that he's talking things relative to Jupiter. So I wrote a little small computer programs. My computer at the time was very, very primitive. And all I could do is write very primitive equations of if everything is perfect. And the first thing I came to the conclusion that the orbit is, the major axis is tilted about 30 degrees to the planet to the orbit of all the other planets, to the ecliptic.
So it's coming in at an angle into the solar system, essentially.
Yes. And again, is that most of the orbit and most of the time, Nibiru is well below the ecliptic. It rises at the ecliptic, obviously, at the pivot points of the ecliptic orbit in general. But if there was a collision at that point, then it cannot be just 30 degrees from the ecliptic. It has to be tilted. It's hard to figure out what exactly tilted it. The astronomers, when they look out at comets, they have a different way to calculate the angles. But for my calculations, I needed to have a different axis system. So I had the axis tilted from the ecliptic and then twisted. What does it mean, twisted? Meaning that part of the orbit is even close to the sun. Part of the orbit is above the eclipse and part is below the eclipse, so that the orbit intersects the ecliptic twice. Once near the sun, and that's where the collision with Tiamat was, and another time somewhere. And the question is where? Well, then I think there are two things. One, I wrote in my little simplified computer, I had a varying orbit or tilts from 0 to 90 degrees to find out where might be the best thing is. And then when I got to somewhere, I don't remember now because it's already 50 years since I did all of this.
Yeah.
I think it's somewhere around 13 degrees or a little more than that. And two interesting things showed up. Clockwise rotation, about 30 degrees tilt, about 13 degrees twist. You know what? That's the orbit of Halley's Comet.
Wow. Real quick on them before we go any further, because you're really getting deep into the weeds here. Most of the original stories about Tiamat and how the planets aligned into their current orbits, I mean, this is millions and millions of years ago, and that was all documented in those Sumerian cuneiform tablets, right? As well as the planet Nibiru. That was all mentioned in all of those tablets that Zacharia was reading.
Yes, but there they don't really talk much about the orbit.
Right.
Why is that important? Again, that it's similar to the orbit of Halley's Comet. I think this is very interesting. Why? Because now the question is, where is the second point that it crosses? It crosses very close to the orbit of Uranus. The closest point, the point where, by my calculation, Nibiru rises and crosses the ecliptic is very, very close to the orbit of Uranus. Now, in the 4 billion years since he was there, it probably passed by about 1 million times. In 4.5 million, divide by 3600 like this. Now that might explain why Uranus got knocked off axis and changed the plane of rotation. You haven't heard that before from anybody, did you?
No, and that's corroborated with modern astronomy. Is that
okay?
Yeah.
The question of what happened to Uranus? What happened to Pluto?
Right.
And I believe that it's Nibiru. One of the moons of Nibiru probably collided with Uranus in one of those million orbits and changed the dynamics, the mass distribution of Uranus, changed the major axis. In order, again, comes my dynamic stability of satellites. Knowledge like this, when you change the mass distribution and the major axis, suddenly the object flips and starts rotating differently. So I believe that my calculation about the orbit of Nibiru explains what happened to Uranus and what happened to Pluto.
And right now, Pluto or Uranus is the one that has that massive, looks like almost like a slash across the side of its surface, right? Or is that Pluto? One of those.
I don't know about the slash. Anyway, the thing is that might explain what pulled Pluto out of Saturn and things like this.
I see.
Anyway, that's kind of some of the things that determine. Beyond that was a question, again, the orbit. The question is speculation about the propulsion. What propulsion was used by the spacecraft when Enki first came from Nibiru to Earth? What was his power plant? And that is speculation. Enki was also known as air, water. So my speculation that this propulsion was some kind of nuclear power, maybe fission, maybe cold fusion that gave them the energy. But they needed ejection mass to go to their engines. And there was lots of water throughout the solar system. So that's my guess.
Gotcha.
That's my guess as why Enki was called water.
Interesting. Let's take a quick step back here, because now we've sort of established an elliptical orbit of the planet Nibiru through our solar system, kind of coming in at an angle around the Earth and then back out again. And modern astronomy, at least in modern research, at least over the last 20 years, they've actually have acknowledged that there is potentially a 10th planet out there. And is that what they're referring to, or is it something else? What?
We are really talking now 9th planet, now that Pluto is not a planet.
There you go, yeah.
Well, the story of the 9th planet is around the year 2000, astronomers started finding things somewhere beyond Neptune. They believe there are all kinds of things are floating out there. And they call them actually trans-Newtonian objects, TNO. Popular Mechanics in about 2 years ago had a big article about it, about new research things about it. And one of the things it says is an interesting thing is that about 70,000 years ago, a small dim dual planet was named after a guy named Schultz, passed by the Oort belt and caused a lot of havoc there. And a lot of debris started coming down. 70,000 years ago, obviously the Anunnaki saw it. They were out there. They were not that far away because by my calculation, all they can go, their planet is about 270 astronomical units away, and the Oort belt is maybe 50,000. Where the Schultz planet passes about 50,000 units. How long does it take for things to start falling from there down to Earth? Some of them, I speculate that the big, not asteroids that devastated Siberia 100 years ago may have been one of those debris that come out from the Oort belt as a result of the Schultz planet passing by there. By the way, right now, I believe the Schultz planet is about 8 light years away. But again, 70,000 years ago, it was about 1 light year away in the Oort planet.
And what is an astronomical unit? What distance is that?
What difference does that make?
Other than I've never heard have that before. So
assume
it's a long way away.
One of the things we see far away in the sky, we know there is some big object passing by there. One of those trans-Neptunian objects, there's a big thing in there. Is it the 9th planet, Nibiru, or is it something new? What is important is what danger are all of those things commit to us. And let's say you are sitting there on Nibiru, and we see from the Schultz planet, objects are hurling toward you. Obviously, in the 70,000 years, Nibiru was there many times. And the thing is something going to be Armageddon? The prophecy of Armageddon, is it the Anunnaki was worrying? Well, again, you have to come back. Why do I come to Armageddon? One of the things that Zacharia was interested in is that little calculation that Isaac Newton did about when will Armageddon be. Let me backtrack a little bit. For a long time, the whole story of the Anunnaki on Earth and all of this thing is what happened 13,000 years ago with the Great Flood and all of these things was hard for me to understand. And then came a change in my thinking. I cannot think in my years. I'm 91 years old, big deal. In the scheme of things, it's nothing. I started thinking in Anunnaki years. Now you get a totally new view of what happened. According to Zacharia and the kings and other things, the Anunnaki came to Earth about 120 years ago. Anunnaki years.
Yeah. Which is the orbit of Nibiru, which is what, 3,600 years?
Yeah, more or less. Okay, one thing that Zacharia was looking for before he passed away is he believed that the period of Nibiru around the sun has changed. He wasn't sure, he was talking 720 years, but I don't think it changed 720 years. I believe that the period of Nibiru did change.
And what made you think that occurred, that change happened?
Well, all of this business of Armageddon.
Gotcha.
And the Schwartz planet made me change on this. Isaac Newton did the calculation on that famous piece of paper that Zacharia saw in the university, in Hebrew University in Jerusalem. That Armageddon will occur, I think, no earlier than 2083 and no later than 3000 and this like this. It's a big period, but think in Anunnaki terms. In Anunnaki terms, it's this year. It's this year. Why? Because when was Nibiru close to Earth? Look at the Jewish calendar. You have to look at the Jewish calendar and say, nah, the calendar is not Jewish. The calendar is started in 6,000-7,000 years ago. There were no Jews in there. It started there in Iraq, started in Sumer, started when the Anunnaki brought civilization to Earth. When Anu visited Earth, that's when it started. Okay.
And what year the Jewish calendar is? What, 5,000? What? How old is it?
It started at 3,640 years ago.
Gotcha.
Or 600, not 3,460 years ago.
Yeah. So it's not 2021 in the Jewish tradition. It's like 5,900 or something.
Now, why is the Jewish calendar important to understand this thing is? One orbit of Nibiru, 3,600 years, was 160 BC. What happened at 160 BC?
That was the first, the temple was first destroyed, right?
No, that was when the Jews rebelled in order to retake the temple and purify it because God was returning. Interesting. 1 year, Nibiru and Enki was coming back. Now, which I think is what happened is, yes, Enki left Earth in the 6th century BC, but it was something he left at the temple in Jerusalem that he wanted back. Let's look at the history of the 6th century BC. I don't have in front of me the exact dates, but Enki and the Anunnaki leave Earth. A few years before they left Earth, the king in Persia overtakes Babylon, and he sends the Jews back to Israel under orders of God. The return of the Jews from Babylon happened when, I forgot the name of the emperor of Persia at the time. But he sacks Babylon, and under the order of God sends the Jews back to Jerusalem. And those Jews keep the temple and renew the temple. That came the Greeks or the Syrian and took it away and defiled the temple. And the Jews know that at the year 160 BC, God is supposed to return. Nibiru is supposed to be returned. But why did the Nephilim leave early? Okay, now comes my speculation. I take all of these things and try to look together. The prophet Daniel lived at the time that the Nephilim left the earth. Okay, we look back years before that, when Enlil wants to destroy a human being on earth and bring the flood. Enki doesn't want them destroyed. So he has his friend Noah, his buddy Noah, an earthling, stand behind the wall, and he tells him, the flood is coming back, all of this thing like this. Because they were sworn, all the Anunnaki were sworn not to tell humans. Okay, so let's say around 600 BC, the Anunnaki plan to leave Earth. They begin to pack. The prophet Daniel sees some commotions in there. So he grabs one of those people in there and says, "What are you doing?" So the person says he's not allowed to tell. So he starts talking gobbledygook. And this gobbledygook, Isaac Newton figured out that Armageddon coming. Now, Enki didn't like human beings. He wouldn't worry about Armageddon for earthlings. But what about the Anunnaki? There are two possibilities. One that is Armageddon, which I think means that one of those comets or planets or debris from the Oort belt is going to cause this Armageddon. It can either hit Earth and make it a big mess in here. Yes, one of those debris was 65 million years ago. Obviously, it was not from the Schultz planet. The asteroid in Siberia may have been that thing, but that's recent. It could be the Anunnaki that was watching very closely all of those debris hurling toward them. Would anything affect them? So either they calculated that something will happen to Earth this year, again, I'm talking this year, which is important. Will hit Earth, and they got to get out of here before it hits Earth.
So when Isaac Newton made his calculation, what was he basing that off of? Was he basing that off of something that Daniel had written down, or what was he basing what was he using for his calculations?
What did Isaac Newton use?
Yes.
Based on the gobbledygook that Daniel says about all this writing on the wall and other things.
So basically he took what Daniel had said, which was essentially his conversation.
I don't know what he said. It doesn't mean anything to us.
Right.
But Isaac Newton used that to figure out when will Armageddon come. And he figured out that it's happening this year. Again, Anunnaki year.
Right. But we don't know when. We don't know when in 3,600 years.
No, he knows it between 2083 and 3000.
Gotcha.
So either if the Armageddon is going to hit Earth, is on Earth, the Anunnaki wants to get out of here. Now, what are the other possibilities? The other possibilities that one of those debris is going to hit Nibiru and there'll be Armageddon on Nibiru. One of the possibilities that if something will happen on Nibiru, two things can happen. One of the things is can either destroy life in there, so the Anunnaki wants to die at home, not on Earth. They needed Nibiru always to support them in different technology on all of these things, or the food, or special to their long life. Without the special food they got from Nibiru, they wouldn't be able to stay and live so long. Or one of those things is going to hit Nibiru and change its orbit. If it changes its orbit, it no longer will come close to Earth.
And so they've got it. Yeah, got it.
So they got to get out.
And that was 600 BC, essentially, is what.
Yes.
Newton
That's, I think, Zacharia figured out 553
Gotcha.
BC. So at least I form all of these sphere of possibilities of what happened. Now, another possibility is that something already, one of these debris already hit Nibiru and changed a little bit its orbit. And that's changed its period of rotation. And that's why at 600 BC was the last chance to get out and meet Nibiru. It's my speculation. Now, if you live long enough and see this period that Newton talks about, let me know.
Well, yeah, I mean, 2080, we're both long gone, and all of that information, all of those theories are all based on the research that he had done over his lifetime, reading those tablets. So this is information that people throughout history have been kind of putting together to kind of help better understand what is going on with that particular planet and like you were saying, Armageddon. So that's it's interesting. Why then? What was it about? I think it was 2012. What was it about 2012 that had the world in an uproar, thinking that was the date?
2012 has something to do with the Mayan calendar.
I see. Okay.
Now, one thing that I wish that Zacharia knew is about Göbekli Tepe. Are you interested in that?
Absolutely. And real quick before we get into it, Göbekli Tepe is in Turkey.
Yes.
And it is by most calculations about 13,000 years ago, which puts it at a time when man was supposed to be just hunters and gatherers running around the woods. But this is a very significant archaeological find. So yeah, I definitely want to hear your take on it.
Well, I found out about Göbekli Tepe when I saw one video on Flixi about the Göbekli Tepe. It says they believe it's about 10,800 years BC, and it was built in there, and then it was covered up. There was something special. I've clicked in my mind, 10,800 BC is exactly the time of the flood. The great flood that destroyed all of the Anunnaki facilities in Mesopotamia was 10,800 BC. Okay, so now let's look at it. I looked up, where is it? Yes, it's in Turkey. Why is it there? Why location? I mean, somebody built it there. Why didn't they build it near a lake? Why didn't they build it near a river? Why did they build it near something? So if you look on the map, it's interesting where it is. Okay. Before the flood, the flight path from Nibiru to Earth, especially the landing was along splitting the Persian Gulf. That's one axis. And straight south from Mount Ararat was the other axis. That was the spaceport. South of it, there were 6 cities that formed kind of a cone of landing. A little south of it was mission control.
In the city of Nippur or down?
All of those things, I'm bad in names. I don't remember all of those things like this. Now, all of those things got flooded and destroyed. But they still recognize the coming in along the Persian Gulf. They still know Ararat, but they need a new mission control. So mission control, instead of being south of the spaceport, there was all a bunch of mud in there. You needed one north of it, high in the mountains, away from the flood. So if you look at the location of Göbekli Tepe, it's exactly on the line of the old spaceport and mission control, the old mission control. Okay, so now that's one place to put Göbekli Tepe. If you look at some of the major structure in there are 2 huge columns, funny columns. They are not oriented east-west, they are not oriented north-south. If you look at the orientation of those, they are exactly on the line, these new lines of flight looking back at the old spaceport, which double implies to me, yes, Göbekli Tepe is the new mission control. Why those strange structure, I don't know. Ask the Anunnaki why they needed all of those other things around and whatever. But why they're along that line? They can be 1,000 miles north, it can be 200 miles south. Okay, now what happened after the flood? If you remember, they moved mission control to Jerusalem. And they built the spaceports in the Sinai Peninsula. Where in the Sinai Peninsula? 2 things happened they needed. They built the pyramids in order to be one of the anchors of the line. somewhere at the southern tip of the peninsula, either in Mount St. Catherine, Mount Savoie, there was the other line. Okay, so that's the cone. Ararat, Jerusalem, or whatever. But why the pyramids at that spot? Where do the Sphinx look to? The Sphinx looks due east. What are they looking at, the empty desert? No, they're looking at the spaceport. You draw a line straight east from the Sphinx. You draw a line from Göbekli Tepe through Jerusalem, and you find out where the spaceport is. So they chose a place for the new mission control in Göbekli Tepe, so it will serve the new spaceport.
That's fascinating. And so so you have Jerusalem, you have Göbekli Tepe, and then you've got Baalbek as well. That was also one of the...
Baalbek seemed to have come later. Baalbek does not seem to be quite that old. Now, again, is technology developed on Nibiru, and the technology develops on Earth pretty rapidly. After a while, they ended up destroying the spaceport in the thing. They found out gold in Americas. They needed Baalbek and all of these things. All of those things you look together, but certainly you can see that obviously the Jerusalem, the Mount, the Temple Mount is obviously an artificial mount with all the huge 1,000-ton rocks there underneath the Temple Mount, forming the base of it. But that's what I believe Göbekli Tepe is. It was built right there to serve initially as mission control to the old spaceport and as a key point to the mission control of the new spaceport. But then mission control was moved to Jerusalem. And that's what made Jerusalem holy. That was the communication center, the old Holy Ark. Holy Ark was some kind of an electric device. You touched it, you get a shock that kills you.
Right.
Something.
Yeah. Well,
something that was hidden. I, again, think that something Enki hid it somewhere as he was in a hurry to leave. The whole story of the Germans looking for the Holy Ark, they did look it, all their interest. Question of why were the Germans so interested in all the antiques in Mesopotamia? It was more than curiosity.
Absolutely.
If there is something in there.
Yep.
But,
so let me ask you this, because we're kind of coming up on time, and I don't want to take up much more of your time. But let's bring it kind of to current, the way technology is right now with astronomy and research into the stars and space. Do you feel like that has what we're finding now is corroborating what you and Zacharia had done, the research you had done 50, 60 years ago?
Well, definitely. There's one thing is, to all of those doubters, is you cannot prove the truth. The only thing to look at it, if something is true, by finding a fault in it. Many of this thing is that all of this story is we don't know. But you take everything that Zacharia wrote He never wanted to speculate until just before he died. He did not want to speculate. He says, this is what I know, this is what's written, this is what I'm sure of. Nothing that he wrote was proven false. Whatever the Sumerians said about what Uranus looks like, what Pluto looks like, what Neptune looks like, what everything looks like that they wrote, eventually our satellites and things in Earth prove right. You know, Voyager 1 and Voyager 2 were sent out in order to see if they find Nibiru. Something they knew is disturbing the planets, and they were looking for Nibiru. This is part of the thing that he wrote in Genesis Revisited, with his relations with the head of the naval astronomy, things like this. But they didn't find anything, I think, because they were looking in the ecliptic plane. And as I said about why it's important what I said, the orbit of Nibiru, most of it is well below the ecliptic plane. And maybe that's why they did not sense how it influences the orbits of Pluto and the other thing is, because it was in a different plane to orbit it. So everything that he did looks like, yes, obviously now we believe in space travel. In 1965, when he started talking about it, 1976, when he published the book, space travel was not very far. Now we talk about going to the moon. Now we talk about going to Mars. Now we talk about going to another star that's light years away. At least sending something in there.
Yeah.
Something intelligent robots.
And that's what I find fascinating is that the research that you two were doing before computers, before all of this incredible technology, now with that incredible technology, they're confirming the things that you were researching that was written 6,000 years ago.
Yes. Yeah.
That's where it gets really, where I really find it fascinating, and I can only imagine what the next 20 years are going to look like with the way technology is going and where we're going to be going in the universe.
Yeah, the thing is again, it's the question of the related to Armageddon is of particular importance to me. And I think it's important to the question is, if the Anunnaki considered Armageddon, consider something happening, how it will affect us, how it will affect them, what is going on. We are looking for the 9th planet. We see something in there. We haven't watched it long enough to really figure out the orbit. It's the orbits, which way is it heading, how it will affect us, and how it will affect the whole solar system. Because if it is connected to what I think is the Schultz planet and the changes what happening in the Oort belt, there's nothing we can do about it.
Right. Right. And, it's amazing that you kind of mentioned those things because Graham Hancock and a couple of other current day researchers have been researching a lot of parts of the Earth that talk about, extinction events, and where they have happened and occurred throughout the history of the universe and the history of the Earth. I mean, it's tough to get your mind around. It's tough for us modern humans to get our minds around something like that happening in the relatively near future.
Yeah, there's not long ago, a big iceberg passed close to the Earth. Suddenly, there wasn't really noticed for a long time until it is. If it hit the Earth, we would have all we wouldn't be talking.
Yeah. Well, I'll tell you what, Amnon, this has been fascinating. This really has been a great interview, and thank you very much for your time. I really, really appreciate it. And some of these things that we were just talking about, I've never heard those theories put out there. So, it makes sense if you look at it when you actually look on a map of where those things are all located relative to each other.
There might be people that I don't spend much time really searching a thing, but you may be in contact with people who look at things that may relate to these things. Maybe if they hear about these things, what I talk about Göbekli Tepe, and what I'm talking about the Schultz planet and the debris and the trans-Neptunian objects and all of these things, they may know related things. They may trigger something in their mind that says, oh, by the way, that gives me an idea that what I see here, what I find. Yeah. I have a personal request that if you learn more about the search for the ninth planet, about what they look at all of these trans-Newtonian objects, what they find in Göbekli Tepe, or whatever things, send me the information.
Absolutely.
Or like this, just satisfy my curiosity.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm sure a lot of your colleague or your friends and Janet's friends that still kind of keep the research that you and Zacharia did, keep that alive. I'm sure they're out there looking, and I know that, with all the current, now I call it a current, the modern space race with Musk and Bezos and all these billionaires who are building spaceships to go deep out into space and to Mars. I mean, at some point we're going to learn a lot more about Göbekli Tepe and about what's going on out beyond our solar system, a lot more than we know now. So yeah, I will definitely keep you on informed if I hear of anything. But like I said earlier, a lot of this stuff is so far over my head. It just fascinates me, and I don't know much about it. So when I actually talk to somebody who does know something about it, I learn a ton. So definitely got my curiosity piqued, and I'm looking forward to seeing what the technology produces moving forward.
Yes.
All right, sir. Well, listen. Amnon Sitchin, thank you very much for your time. This was a great conversation.
Just one more thing is, if anybody listens to you or my advice, don't waste money sending a human being to Mars. By the time we can be prepared to do that, we would have a very smart robots. We can send 100 robots to Mars for the same cost of sending one human being and bringing him back.
Yeah,
spend the money on the robots.
That makes sense, and we will see. It's future's unfolding in front of us right now. So, well, listen, thank you again. I really appreciate your time. And let me just close off by saying what I always do at the end of my interviews. If you're in the military, the police departments, fire departments, or first responders, if that's you out there, thank you very much for your service. Stay safe. Amnon Sitchin. Thank you very much, sir.
You're welcome.
All right. This is the Rain Man. Thanks for watching. Thanks for watching Rain Man's Take, Observations of the World We Live In. If you like the content, don't forget to hit the subscribe button below. You can also follow RAINMAN'S Take on Instagram at RAINMAN'S Take. Also, check out our website at www.rainmanstakepodcast.com and send your comments to rainmanstake@gmail.com. Keep an eye out for future podcasts, which will be coming out every Thursday at 5 p.m. West Coast time.